just really excited to be able to sit down today with our two great speakers, two experts in educational equity for all students, but particularly for those of color and living in poverty. This is a fireside chat. I do not have a fire at home, so you just have to imagine one behind me as we go through this. But to be able to speak with John King, who is the president and CEO of Education Trust and former Secretary of Education under Barack Obama. He's also a fellow Boricua, Puerto Rican, so I always like to say that because there's some identity connection there. As well as Ian Rosenblum, who's the Executive Director for the Education Trust's New York Division and former Deputy Secretary of Education and Economic Development in New York. We're really excited. John is also a judge for the very competitive and prestigious Evergreen National Prize, which bottom line just found out we won last week. So thanks to John for that. That's great. And we're really excited to have been chosen from 15 or 20 top-notch organizations by the Evergreen Prize Committee, which was really great. So super excited to have John here. And Ian, would love to get started. I'm actually not seeing them in the, do we have John? Are John and Ian here?
Yes.
Hi, this is Ian.
Hey, there you are. Okay,
yes.
Just want to make sure you're there. Hey, John, I got nervous for a second. John, welcome. Ian, welcome. Appreciate you both being here. John, I'd love for you to just start with a little introduction of yourself. And for those who are not familiar about what Education Trust is and what you all do on a daily basis, would love for you to share a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, it's great. It's great to see you, Steve. Congratulations again on the Evergreen Prize. It's good to be with the Bottom Line community that I've long admired, and it's good to see some old friends like Cass and Leslie, who I've known for a long time. So glad to be here with you all. At the Ed Trust, our mission is advancing education equity for low-income students and students of color. We do work really starting with preschool through K through 12 into higher ed. So lots of overlap between our focus and yours at Bottom Line, both thinking about post-secondary transitions for high school students and college access, affordability, and completion, particularly for historically underserved students, low-income students, students of color, first-gen students, justice-impacted students, undocumented students, students who are also parents. So this conversation very much aligns with the focus of our work at Ed Trust. In terms of my background, just say quickly, I am first and foremost a high school social studies teacher, and then a middle school principal, and then got into education policy, working at the state level as Commissioner of Education in New York, when Ian and I got a chance to work together when he was working for Governor Cuomo, and then came down to DC to work for President Obama, first as Deputy Secretary of Education and then as Secretary of Education. And when I was deciding what to do after the administration ended, I wanted to be in an organization that reflected the values that have driven my whole career, a focus on the students who haven't had access to opportunity historically. And Ed Trust has long championed issues of education equity and has a mix of research work, very high quality, data-driven research, but also advocacy. We work with other civil rights organizations, parent groups, educator groups, the business community across multiple states as well as at the federal level to advance an equity agenda. And we have offices in California, Michigan, New York. We've got folks on the ground in Massachusetts, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Texas, and coalitions that we support in a number of other states. And Ian is one of our phenomenal state leaders. I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you. My name is Ian Rosenblum. I'm the founding executive director of Education Trust New York, which, as John said, is the New York State office. We focus primarily on state level policy and advocacy work from birth to 3 to K-12 to college access, persistence, and completion, all through an equity lens. And we were launched just over 4 years ago now.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks, John, for being here. Really appreciate that sort of overview of Ed Trust. It's an organization that we have, I've had respect for, not just during your tenure, but back in the Amy Wilkins days. And it's just been just on the forefront of the work. So thank you for that. Can we just talk a little bit about what you all are seeing now, both nationally and the New York level? Can we talk a little bit about how you all are seeing students' needs shifting due to the pandemic? And as you think about that, you know, how you're thinking the systems K through 12 and higher ed need to evolve to be able to address those needs?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the reality is COVID has been, as you know, Steve, an equity disaster for young people in America. I mean, there's just no question. The epidemic itself, the pandemic itself, has had a disparate impact on communities of color and low-income communities. Black and Latino folks are 3 times as likely to get COVID, twice as likely to die from COVID when they do get it. The economic crisis created by COVID has had a disparate impact on low-income communities and Black and Latino communities in particular, higher rates of unemployment, loss of income. And of course, all of that then affects students in both our K-12 system and in post-secondary education. In K-12, we know Black and Latino students are more likely to be in the districts that didn't have the resources to do quality professional development for teachers around distance learning. They were more likely to be without devices in the home. And it's not just a device, but a device for each child to be doing their work simultaneously. There are big disparities in internet access. National data suggests that about 79% of white folks have reliable internet access, 66% of African Americans, 61% of Latinos. So we know in places like LA, you had a quarter of students who couldn't log on, who didn't log on in the spring. So you've got huge challenges around educational access. The spring was devastating. McKinsey did a study suggesting 7 months on average nationally of learning loss, 9 months for Latino students, 10 months for African American students. We know FAFSA completion was down. We are already seeing from summer data declines in enrollment, particularly for African American students in higher ed. So that was the spring. Now we enter a fall where in many places, and you know this particularly in New York and the struggles that New York City is having, in many places, kids are still not getting what they need. You know, I think it's a national embarrassment that we did not as a country step up with the resources necessary, at least to make sure every kid had a device and internet access. But we also are seeing many places that are either distance or hybrid where there really isn't adequate support for student success academically. Students are experiencing huge socio-emotional challenges. I was a kid, I lost both my parents as a kid. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The thing that saved me was relationships at school. So my heart breaks for kids who now have been without those relationships, in some cases for months, the degree of isolation. And so we have this socio-emotional impact, and then we have huge increase in food insecurity, 14 million kids who are food insecure. So there's a lot that schools are struggling with, and then certainly in higher ed, we're seeing parallel challenges. A lot of students who don't have reliable internet access, don't have the proper places to be working at home on their schoolwork. A lot of students who are struggling financially to stay in school or struggling financially to support their families through this economic crisis. So the degree of need, and I'm sure you're seeing this with the students you support, the degree of need has just been so heightened for both our high school students if we want them to make it to college, and then for our college students to help them stay in school and finish.
Yeah, I mean, it's sobering. It's sobering to hear. And as a parent who is relatively privileged, having my two boys try to navigate the K-12 system here in New York in the public schools, it's been difficult for us, right? And we have lots of privilege and resources to do it. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Ian, anything you'd add from a New York context on to give some New York sort of view of the way those numbers look for us here in the city?
I think just briefly, I'd add a couple of things. We often say that the pandemic has exacerbated the pre-existing inequities in our education system, certainly in K-12 and the same true in higher ed. And I think that we're seeing that really clearly this fall in both the academic and the non-academic challenges that students are facing. One of our key concerns is that school districts, particularly those that enroll historically underserved groups of students, did not learn many of the lessons from spring school closures, which obviously they could not predict and have prepared for in advance when it comes to things like the quality of remote instruction and the importance of relationships and ensuring regular interaction between students and teachers. Fast forward now almost 6 months, schools are reopening either in person or more frequently, obviously, remotely or hybrid. And it's clear that many school districts are doing the same things that they were doing in the spring, or more importantly, not doing the things that they weren't doing when schools were closed the first time. We had a chance to look at the district reopening plans in the largest school districts in New York State. And it seems like one clear trend is that on the positive side, districts saw that many of their students did not have technology access, and so they took some really concrete steps to address that. They didn't do the same as much for educators, whose technology needs are obviously also critical if remote learning is to work. And equally notably, we continue to see major gaps on issues like the quality of instruction, the curriculum that's used, engagement and interaction, and thinking about the transition of students, high school students, from K-12 into college or into careers.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I was looking, John, you and I think had talked about this one of the previous times we got a chance to talk, but we've been worried about sort of the impact on enrollment, right? And National Student Clearinghouse just reported on summer enrollment, and summer enrollment was actually down, particularly for males, particularly for Black males. And so we saw a decrease in the summer, and I think there's lots of folks really worried about the fall data, and I know it'll be weeks before NCS has fall enrollment data, but when you think about this, do you have any sense of how you think these trends may impact enrollment in the fall? What are your thoughts around fall enrollment vis-a-vis the challenges you just mentioned?
Yeah, well, what's somewhat jarring about the data here is, in the past, when we've had an economic crisis, we've actually seen post-secondary enrollment go up, right? Because people are looking to get additional skills, or people are making the choice that if there aren't good jobs available, let me pursue education so that I can compete for jobs. I worry that this time we're not seeing that. And I think there are a number of factors driving that. One is people look at the cost of higher ed, and then the experience, if it's going to be remote or largely remote, and they conclude, look, I'm not gonna make that investment now. But the worry is, for low-income students, for first-gen students, momentum is so important. And I worry that we have a whole set of seniors who decided in the spring not to start college because it was going to be remote. And will they ever come back? Will we be able to convince them to come back down the road? So I think we're going to see a hit there, seniors who aren't enrolling in college. But I think we're going to see a decline in persistence. I think we're going to see students who are leaving for financial reasons, in some cases where their family's been hit by the economic consequences of COVID, or they personally, whatever job they were doing that was helping them pay for school now has gone away. And those students will leave school for financial reasons. I think you'll see students leave because they experienced distance learning in the spring and struggled. And of course, it's the students who are most academically vulnerable, who most need support, who are most likely to struggle in that distance learning context. And so I think we'll lose some students there. We have, a fifth of our college students are parents. And so the collapse of childcare nationally, the 0 to 4 childcare sector, and number of school closures or hybrid models mean that for those parents, getting to school just became a lot harder. If your kid is only in school 2 days a week, it makes it very hard for you to organize your schedule so you can continue school. So I'm very worried. I think it's going to be very variable. The elite institutions, with large endowments, they'll probably see the least melt. They can also backfill with the long line of applicants that they have to fill those spaces. And they have students who will take a gap year, and for them that gap year means, some interesting year off activities funded by their parents. It's not the same as for low-income students who don't have those opportunities. But I think for our community colleges, for our regional public institutions, for some of the smaller liberal arts colleges that don't have very much in the way of endowment, I think we're going to be grappling with the consequences of significant enrollment loss. And then just to layer on another depressing point, the economic crisis is going to hit state budgets. And if Congress fails to act, you're going to see states making cuts. CUNY is already experiencing this. You're going to see states cutting public higher ed at this very moment of crisis. That's going to mean reductions to the very kinds of support programs that help first-gen students make it through college. So the urgent need for bottom line supports just couldn't be greater.
Yeah, it's super helpful. And I wonder if you and Ian can talk a little bit about, I think that the third leg of that stool, right? You talked about sort of the existing COVID impact and what that means to teaching and learning in the fall and how that's impacting decisions. You talked a little bit about the pending economic impact for public institutions, of which many bottom line students take advantage of. I think the other thing that I've at least had in my mind is the pending decrease in the population of students who are graduating overall, and the increasing, and that there's an increasing percentage of those students who look like bottom line students, right? They are less financially able to afford college. They are typically Black and brown students, and so and those students go to college at a lesser rate than their peers. And so wondering how you all have been thinking about the trifecta of issues on the future of higher ed. And if you can speak a little bit about, and I think you were going there, John, on just the importance of what institutions like higher institutions and what bottom line needs to do to address those challenges.
Ian, you want to start?
Sure. One of the things that we and our colleagues in California did together in the spring was to conduct or commission a poll of current college students nationwide, and then focusing more on New York. And I think is useful to help us think about this question a bit because it really, from our perspective, shines a light on the lived experiences of students in the early part of the pandemic. One of the things that we heard clearly in the poll is that the vast majority of students were still planning to return to college in the fall. And yet 4 in 5 New York college students were concerned about being on track to graduate. And when we asked them, well, if school is still remote in the fall, what has to get better? The concerns that they raised are the same ones that we've been talking about. The quality of instruction and course offerings, the need for study tools, the availability of tutoring and other academic support resources. In fact, about 86% of students in the poll said that they want more academic support, including advising, only 61% said that their campuses were currently offering it at that time. And then, of course, couple that with one, the fact that students of color were less likely to say that they were receiving critical supports than their peers. And two, nearly 3 in 4 of the students surveyed said that they'll need additional financial aid in order to be able to make it through college. I think sets up the exact crisis that we're seeing now in the return to school, coupled, of course, with the pending fiscal crisis that John described. From an advocacy perspective, we're focused on encouraging the state to ensure that institutions are focusing on all of those issues, and then also thinking a little longer term, the need for an attainment goal, so that New York State develops a real comprehensive policy that ensures that there are more students, and in particular, more students of color, more students from low-income backgrounds, and other historically underserved groups, making it not only to, but through college as well. And the pandemic, from our perspective, makes that more important than ever.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. John, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the first time I ever had the honor to meet you. I was at a previous job, and we were talking about advanced placement, and we were talking about really getting students access to rigorous high school curriculum. And at that point, we were talking about, you and I were talking a lot about just the need for both K through 12 and higher ed to evolve to the needs of young men of color, young male, Black and brown students, and how that's such a, the gaps are largest with them. And I think as you think about that, both at the K through 12 and the higher ed side, what are your thoughts for organizations like ours to be doing to make sure that that population of students who are most at risk at falling off, and the NSC data prove that, right? Like, what can we be doing to make sure that we are able to better recruit and serve young men of color who I think are most at need during this moment?
Yeah. Well, I think at the high school level, there's just tremendous need for relationship-based intervention and support. So, and it operates on a number of levels. One, I worry about the sort of academically vulnerable student leaving school without that regular connection to adults in the school building, with all of the economic pressures on families. I worry that some of those young men who are already struggling with grades, maybe struggling with some of the rules at school, so forth, will just throw in the towel and walk away. So I worry about seeing an increase in dropout. But I also worry about the sort of middle tier academic student who desperately needs coaching and advice, needs someone to say, hey, you got an A in science last year, maybe you should think about taking an AP class. Or, I know you have an empty spot on your schedule. Have you thought about dual enrollment as an opportunity to get some college credit and start to transition into the college experience? And students might have gotten that from a counselor, although we don't have as much counselor support as we should in our schools, particularly our low-income schools. But now, if they're virtual or hybrid, their opportunities to get that advice from a counselor or teacher are greatly diminished. So the sort of advising and coaching for that middle student who could kind of go either way, might go on to college, might not, the urgency of advising has really increased. It's true around the FAFSA. A lot of high schools have FAFSA night so that everybody could come and learn about the FAFSA and get some guidance. Well, now with COVID, we're not having FAFSA night, or maybe we're doing it on Zoom, and kids and their parents aren't necessarily likely to jump on that Zoom if they're not already thinking about college. So how do we, again, have the advisor be the one who draws kids in and checks with them and follows up, and did you finish the form, and let's talk about schools that you might be interested in. I'm really worried. I have a 12th grader. She's going to get more advice and coaching than she probably wants from her parents around the post-secondary transition process. But she's in a socioeconomically, racially diverse school in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I worry about her peers who aren't getting that support at home, particularly her peers who might be first-generation college students. Someone needs to intervene with them to help coach them around the college application and financial aid application process. So there's a lot of work, I think, for Bottom Line to be doing. I wish we could scale more quickly because there is so much need at the high school level. And then, just to amplify Ian's point about what students need in college, CUNY has been able to double the completion rate for community college students with a program called ASAP, which provides wraparound support, everything from MetroCard to academic advising and just-in-time financial assistance. Well, programs like ASAP are exactly what's going to be on the chopping block as states and local communities and public higher ed institutions grapple with the financial crisis. And so you're going to see reduced intervention programs at the higher ed level at the moment when students most need them. And so that's another place where, I hope Bottom Line is able to step in.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. I mean, Ian, when you think about that same issue sort of in a very sort of New York-centric context, what kind of priorities or recommendations are you, like, in Ed Trust New York, trying to push with both K-12 and higher ed to make sure that they're able to address these inequities?
This is really a high priority for our work. And we and our civil rights education parent and business partners have been focused on advanced course access for a few years now. In New York City and state, the data show that our education system gives white students and students who are not from low-income backgrounds about 2 to 3 times more access to a whole range of advanced courses in middle and high school than students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And it's not only an issue of who gets access to preparation early that would enable them to be ready for those classes, but the selection for who has access to those classes and is encouraged to enroll in them. We looked at the specific policies in 100 school districts in New York State, and the resulting piece that we put out was called The Gatekeepers, because what we found, not surprising to the people on this call, is that the policies that school districts put in place, rigid tracking, requirements that have no direct relationship to actual success in the course, an over-reliance on teacher recommendations and other factors that could reflect implicit bias, are the very things that increase the inequities in course access. And so when we think about advising could be the thing that knocks down those gates and makes course access more equitable. And so we see that as being really critical to changing the dynamic in enrollment in advanced courses in both middle and high school as part of a broader strategy that also includes more information for families, the elimination of some of those barriers, and as we're seeing in some other states, automatic enrollment in advanced courses for students who are able to demonstrate readiness across multiple measures. And so that's some of what we're really focused on right now. We're doing some work in the midst of the pandemic to see how schools have allocated those really even probably rarer seats in advanced courses this fall. And we're concerned that they'll show a lot of moving backwards, even compared to some of the progress that some school districts were making previously.
Thanks, Ian. Well, I've been monopolizing the questions. I want to give other folks a chance to jump in, but I can talk to the two of y'all forever. Wanted to open it up. Do folks have any questions? Feel free to sort of take yourself off mute and jump right in.
I do have a question. I've been waiting for a long time.
Go ahead, Lo.
Okay. Hi, my name is Lo. I'm a success team manager at Bottom Line. And my question is for John King. So I know that you mentioned that some of the Ivy Leagues are going to be okay, but I've been doing a lot of research and reading a lot of articles that are saying that Ivy League education may be over. So I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and if you think that that's a good thing for the American education system. What are your thoughts?
So acknowledging that there's variety amongst the schools. I would say that the the most elite institutions, the Ivy League, as well as the highly selective small liberal arts colleges like Williams, Amherst, their endowments are sufficiently large that they're going to be fine. I mean, I'm sure their chief financial officers are stressed out, but they have sufficient resources that they can absorb not having students on campus, missing out on, room and board and fees. They can absorb any kind of melt in their enrollment or matriculation. They'll be fine. There's another set of private colleges that don't have those endowments, that are highly tuition dependent. And I think those institutions are in real financial trouble because they need the room and board and the fees to keep operating. I mean, their financial model is built on that. Many of those institutions are also very reliant on enrolling international students, and declining enrollment of international students because of COVID-related restrictions, but also just the impact of COVID on students' ability to travel for education. That's going to mean those institutions are now trying to figure out how do they find full-paying students, because many of those international students were full-paying. So those institutions, I think, are going to face very significant challenges. And it's likely that some of them won't survive, or they'll merge. I also think there's going to be increased pressure from students after this experience of distance learning. Going to be increased pressure from students to say, what exactly is it that I'm paying for when I pay this huge check each year? And we may see growth in places like Southern New Hampshire and Arizona State, places that are doing distance learning at scale relatively efficiently. And students may say to themselves, well, maybe I'll just do that rather than paying for the private college tuition, room and board, fees, all of that. So this could be a transformative moment for the sector. My worry is, if we're not intentional about it, that transformation will not close equity gaps, it will widen them.
Great point, John.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I'll jump in. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yeah, we can, Arthur. Thanks.
Hi. So I'm a native New Yorker and first-generation college student, so I'm thrilled to be working with Bottom Line. And I have I have two sons. One son went through college, med school, as a surgical resident. My youngest son went to college, all the privileges, dropped out. Now he's okay. He's working and doing some online work. But what it helped me appreciate is that there are an awful lot of kids that get in but don't persist because of a host of reasons. And then when they don't persist, there's no reclamation process. There's no, when it goes back around to say, you got 2 years in, let's see how we can help you finish. So what are your thoughts about data on those numbers, and how can we help those students persist, but then also maybe get back on the horse and finish?
Yes, no, it's a great question. So, I think the evidence around persistence is that the better relationships, better advising help advance completion. So I think about, Georgia State, for example. Georgia State has essentially closed the completion gap based on race and income. And they've done it through two primary vehicles. One, what they call intrusive advising, I call nagging, right? But at Georgia State, if you get a bad midterm grade, the advisor calls you and says, what happened here? What's your plan? Have you been to office hours? Have you met with the professor? Are you in a study group, right? So the advisor, they've built a system and they've invested in a cadre of advisors that are able to intensively support and coach students. The other thing that Georgia State has done is they have something called Panther grants, where if you have a financial crisis, the college will step in. So we know there are students who end up dropping out or stopping out because the car broke down and they need $500 to pay for car repairs. And if they can't repair their car, they can't get to school or work. So they end up dropping out. Or students who can't enroll for the new semester because they owe fees from the prior semester. And so what Georgia State has done is they've created this Panther grant program that gives you an emergency grant to take care of those kinds of things. And the combination of that sort of intrusive advising and the financial assistance has helped them close that gap. More broadly, we have millions of folks who have, or just as you described, some credits, no degree. They're actually in a terrible financial position, many of them, because they owe money for the credits they have, but they can't get a good job because they don't have a degree. So they're just trapped. Because without the good job, they can't afford to go back to school to complete the degree. There are a couple places that are starting to tackle this. Wayne State in Michigan has a program where they offer to basically pay down your debt in exchange for coming back. So they are sort of incentivizing students to come back and finish their degree by forgiving some of what they owe in exchange for them returning to campus. That strikes me as very smart. I think we need institutions to take a lot more ownership of convincing students to come back. We also need public higher ed to do a better job on credit transferability, because as you know, as I'm sure you've seen in working with students at Bottom Line, we have students who attend 3-4 schools over the course of their education, and they end up paying for their, 150% of the credits they needed because credits aren't transferable between institutions. And maybe you can understand how that happens between two private colleges in different places, but the fact that it happens between public colleges within the same system that are a borough apart or a few miles apart within the state, that does not make sense. That is solvable.
John and Ian, we want to be respectful of your time. We've got 2 minutes left, and John, last couple of times we've tried to end on a positive note. I'd love for you to just maybe spend a moment or two from both you and Ian on what you're optimistic about in the closing couple of minutes. What gives you faith moving forward?
Steve, this is Burhan here. I was wondering if I could squeeze in one tiny question before John ends on that optimistic note.
Sure.
Just in terms of any programmatic interventions, I know when Ian spoke, he did a good job of laying out some of the disparities, and John mentioned that as well. If online learning, virtual education is going to be the de facto mode for some length of time, is Bottom Line working on any programmatic intervention, maybe with corporate partnerships like with Verizon or Comcast or whatever else, to provide these communities access to basic things like the internet? Right? How are people supposed to level the playing field when they're struggling for basic internet? And while small, I think it has a huge ripple effect in how some of the educational services are experienced and consumed, right? And that is vital for people trying to still catch up and sort of adjust to the new normal. So just wanted to get, perspective from the team on what they've been able to see or do.
Yeah, I can jump in here because I think I've got a good sense on sort of the bottom line answer on that, which is, what we've started to see. We connected with our students early on last year when we went remote, and we started to see very small percentage of them have had issues related to devices and internet. There were bigger issues and more pressing issues for them, I think, related to how that internet is used in teaching and learning. And so what we've been doing in each of our regions is to try to collect scholarship dollars that we can use to help solve that need as they arise. So if a student says, I don't have internet at home, have the advisor work with them to either try to apply for free internet, and maybe we pay the last bill because they can't apply for it, or get them a a system. And so like, I think for me, for us, it's been about trying to solve those as they get brought up through the advisor, these point in time issues around lack of access, or, I think what we hear mostly is, I don't know that I have a quiet place to study, right? I've got internet access, but I've got 8 people using it at home, and so where can I actually do my work? But we've been trying to sort of fill those needs on a piece by piece meal.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add on the internet piece, there's bills in Congress that should be a part of a next stimulus package, whenever that happens, that would try to address expanded internet access in K-12 through the E-rate program. And there's a bill that Congresswoman Eshoo and Senator Klobuchar have that would dedicate targeted funds to higher ed students, particularly in minority serving institutions, to get folks internet access. But to me, this is just an embarrassment for our country. Wealthiest country in the world, this is an eminently solvable problem, particularly in urban and suburban contexts. In some of the rural contexts, it's more challenging because we need to lay new fiber. But in an urban and suburban context, this is eminently solvable, and we just need the political will to do it. So on a more hopeful note, look, the work of organizations like Bottom Line, not to play to the crowd, but makes me hopeful. I mean, we know what's needed in this moment is exactly the kind of relationship-driven advising and coaching that Bottom Line is providing. We need more of that, a lot more of that. I'm also hopeful that the organizing that we're seeing around the issue of police violence and this moment of sort of national reckoning with issues of racial justice will cause institutions to more closely examine their behavior and ask, what more can they do to close equity gaps? So almost every higher ed institution put out some sort of statement last spring of solidarity with Black Lives Matter and some kind of commitment to address issues of systemic racism. And part of what we do at EdTrust is sort of hold up those statements to people and say, okay, appreciate the rhetorical commitment. Now, where's the substantive commitment? To enroll students of color, to enroll low-income students, to provide them with the supports to finish, to hire diverse faculty members, to create campus climates that are supportive for students of color, low-income students, first-gen students, undocumented students, justice-impacted students. Where is the commitment to help students make successfully the transition from college to the workforce? Where is the commitment to a curriculum that prepares all students to be participants in a racially diverse society? So I try to draw inspiration from the piece that John Lewis published on the day of his funeral, the last piece he wrote. But he talked about the young people who are protesting and being inspired by them and their certainty that they can make it better, and their willingness to put themselves on the line, put themselves at risk in order to make our society more just.
Thank you for that, John. Those are great words to end on. I want to thank you, John and Ian, for just being here with us here today, for sharing a little bit of you with us today, and for the thoughtful, intentional way in which you engage in this conversation. We really deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the work you guys do on behalf of students.
Thank
John,
you.
Ian, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.